Hello everyone, Signet here, and welcome to my Guild Wars 1 skill review project. Today I'm talking about the leadership attribute line in the Paragon profession, and we're going to be starting with a little bit of a reminder. Leadership is the primary attribute of the Paragon, and it gains them 2 energy for each ally affected by one of their shouts or chants whenever they use a shout or chant, but it caps at maximum of 1 energy for every 2 ranks. So what that means is that you really don't want odd amounts of leadership. You want even amounts. The only reason to have odd amount is for insurance against weakness that decreases all of your attributes by 1. So 12 leadership will, for example, cap you at 6 energy. 13 will also cap you at 6 energy. 14 will cap you at 7. So that's why odd amounts are less useful. A lot of the leadership skills, of which there are, in fact, most of the Paragon skills are in leadership. In terms of there's 22 there, and all of the other ones have fewer. Therefore, are going to be skills that you're often going to have access to because you usually want some amount of leadership because the Paragon just does not work very well without leadership. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump into it, starting with Lead the Way. Lead the Way is 10 energy in 8-second recharge. It is a shout. Target ally moves 25% faster for 4 seconds for each ally within earshot, maximum of 20 seconds. So if there are 5 allies in earshot, which is certainly reasonable, then the ally you target with this will move 25% faster for 20 seconds, that maximum cap. This only has an 8-second recharge, which is actually pretty low. It is 10 energy, though, which is kind of high. Again, because you're only targeting 1 ally, leadership only refunds 2 energy on this. I like the design of this skill in that I think it plays in a very interesting spot. It cares about the number of allies around you in a way that is interesting, and that's a sub-theme of Paragon. I like that sub-theme. I think that's an interesting one. It plays into the idea of them being leaders. There's a couple of issues with that sub-theme, though, in that the party size has a big impact on it, as well as other stuff that makes more allies. So I don't talk about this a lot, but there are summoning stones. It's a consumable item for the most part that you can use to create an ally to follow you around. And there are also a couple of skills that can summon allies. Those sorts of skills can, as far as I understand anyway, increase the count for things that care about the number of allies around you. And so they can be used to compensate in areas that are like 4-person parties, 6-person parties for that party count. But the fact that Paragon is mechanically affected in terms of the effectiveness of their skills based upon, like in a very potent and straightforward way, especially leadership, based upon the party cap of an area is kind of a big issue. Now, leadership got that tweak to be 2 energy. It used to be 1. And worked a little bit differently. But the 2 energy was to make it so that way they weren't intrinsically restricted by being in an area that had only 4 party members. But Lead the Way is still going to be affected by that sort of stuff. It's just kind of an odd quirk, and I thought it's kind of worth bringing up because it's a design thing that you want to consider when if you're doing something like that where your party size is changing. Consider how that change is going to affect some of your skills, and maybe that's a change that you want to have happen, but maybe it's not. It's good to be aware of. I'm going to give Lead the Way a 3. I don't typically use this skill, but I think it's a fine skill to an extent. I like the design of it well enough. It's useful for like making an attacker go faster, which is what the name implies, but it's also actually quite useful for allowing you to make a caster or something be able to flee enemies attacking them, which is useful to be aware of as well. So, but it is kind of expensive, but I do like that it's a single target skill. I like those in Paragon because I think that they are a more interesting area to play around in. It does compete with Windborne Speed, but I think it competes reasonably well in that it can't be removed, unlike Windborne Speed. So your mileage may vary on some of that, though. Make Your Time. This is 10 energy, 30-second recharge, shout. You gain 1 strike of adrenaline for each party member with an earshot, maximum of 4 adrenaline. So this will always gain you at least 1 strike of adrenaline because you're in earshot of yourself. Just wanted to point that out. This doesn't have sort of the party cap problems because it is, at least at this attribute level, because it is capping out at 4. Okay. So this feels like it's a reference to the, oh man, Ancient Now. I mean, keep in mind, this game came out in like 2006, so it's much more recent at the time. And I forget the name of it, but there's that badly translated cutscene in an older video game. It's like Make Your Time and stuff like that. I think this is coming from that, or is a reference to that. Anyway, that's a little piece of trivia. I don't like this skill very much. It is very expensive at 10 energy, which is okay for like building up your adrenaline, but has the issue of capping out kind of low and having a very long recharge. Here's the thing. If I switch over to Warrior and put, say, commensurate number of points in Tactics, this is where Tactics, unfortunately, is going to come up a lot when talking about Paragon, because Tactics is very similar, because it's got things like Watch Yourself, which is kind of playing the same space. Here's To the Limit, which is for each foe within earshot. You gain maximum of 5, you gain a strike of adrenaline, and it increases your maximum HP, which is a nice little bonus. This is only 5 energy with a 15-second recharge. Now, if I have a more reasonable amount, that's 4, which is the same cap. Still 4 at 9. Still 4 at 8. It goes down to 3. So 8 is a very reasonable amount to put into Tactics. And there's other things that you can use okay in Tactics. This character doesn't have everything filled out, but things like Watch Yourself and Shields Up, particularly Watch Yourself, are usable skills. I bring this up just because To the Limit is a skill that I would argue is better as a result of its much lower costs than... I need to scroll up and up and up. Then Make Your Time. Make Your Time is ostensibly more reliable because you should have your party members around you, but it's not hard for To the Limit to, in fact, gain you 4 strikes of adrenaline. And Make Your Time has twice the energy cost and twice the recharge. It just feels kind of weak. I'm going to give it a 2. Always think about how things compare. If I'm going into my primary attribute to try to gain myself adrenaline, I feel like I want a skill that feels more effective than Make Your Time actually is. So that's kind of my big issue with it. If this was something a little bit different, I could see it. Like, what I mean by that is if it was like each party member gains a strike of adrenaline or something like that would be a little bit more interesting and a good way to start a battle, but it's just, this is satted a little bit too high, and that makes it a little bit weak and kind of unexciting. And I feel that something like, the other one, To the Limit, is just a better execution of this idea, in that triggering off of enemies is more useful, and usually I'm going to want to be able to get it on attackers and stuff that really want to get out of the gate going strong with a nice initial investment of adrenaline. And faster recharge matters a lot for that because it has better uptime and all that sort of stuff. So, yeah, that's kind of where this thing sits. They're on fire. 10 energy, 10-second recharge, shout. For 10 seconds, party members within earshot take 29% less damage than foes from foes suffering from burning. This is a really nice skill in certain build-around situations. I'm not going to casually bring this because it doesn't do anything unless I'm setting enemies on fire. I guess if there's lava around you, it's nice because things get set on lava and just continually inflicts burning and crippled. That's what it does. It's really nasty because burning is a lot of damage when it's staying on you indefinitely. But They're on Fire is some nice damage mitigation, but it works best in like a Searing Flames party or something like that that's causing a lot of burning reliably to enemies. It is absolute trash against destroyers because they're immune to burning. Worth mentioning. There is a bit of a burning sub-theme in Paragon. But yeah, this is a 2. This is a very powerful build around me, but it is a powerful build around me. You can keep it up indefinitely with 1 Paragon, which is really nice. And 29% less damage is a lot less damage, but you do really need to be inflicting consistent burning on enemies to make this worthwhile. So you do have to build around it, I feel. So I'd probably want at least a couple like Searing Flames or something like that. But I like build around me's like this, and it's a great shout. It's a great name for a shout skill. Aggressive Refrain. Oh man, this skill's stats. So this is, for some reason it does not have a PvP version. I think we just got that in both PvP and PvE. So Aggressive Refrain is 25 energy, 2-second activation time, 20-second recharge, echo. For 21 seconds, you attack 25% faster, but have minus 20 armor. And then it is reapplied every time a chant or shout on you ends, like all echoes do. This skill has gotten nerfed repeatedly because unremovable echoes that last indefinitely because of refrains, it's an inherently powerful concept. And that means that a skill has to be comparatively terrible if the effect is very strong. And increasing your attack speed is a very strong effect, especially one that can last indefinitely. So this one has a couple of downsides. A long activation time, making it easy to interrupt, and an incredibly high energy cost are two parts of that. But also the minus 20 armor. Minus 20 armor is a huge downside. It makes you take a lot more damage. So it basically effectively drops you from 80 armor to 60 in terms of base armor, which is a pretty big downside. This skill is still really strong, even at this, just because it is increased attack speed that can be kept up indefinitely. I do think there are arguments that something like Flurry can be used instead of it. Flurry, of course, being a warrior stance, no attribute stance. That increases your attack speed by 33% for 5 seconds, but causes you to deal less damage. This is kind of energy intensive. Paragon can manage it with like a Zealous Spear off of just natural regen, and then the energy regained from using shouts and chants compensates for it. This is an option. You could, of course, use Frenzy as well. I don't have that on this character, but you can dip into some of those skills to increase your attack speed as a Paragon. Just want to point out that you have options there. But Aggressive Refrain is basically one of two. The other one, I think, is Soldier's Fury, of attack skills that you have access to as a Paragon. And it's the non-elite version. So I'm going to give this one a 3. I don't tend to use it that often because it is kind of bulky and unwieldy. You definitely want to be re-triggering it in order to make use of it. If you're not re-triggering, like if you're not keeping it up from shouts and chants ending on you, it's obviously not very good, but that's super easy to do with Go for the Eyes and things like that. So it is awkward to have to apply it at the start of battle, so it definitely works better in teams that are using fallback as well. Just something to keep in mind. Yeah, I don't know. The skill inherently demonstrates the intrinsic difficult to balance intrinsic power of the refrain style of echoes. Okay, Angelic Bond. Angelic Bond. Dun, 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 dun. Hopefully the thing doesn't catch that. But 5 energy, 1 second activation time, 30-second recharge, elite skill. For 10 seconds, the next time an ally within earshot would take fatal damage, that ally or that damage is negated, and that ally is healed for 164 health, and Angelic Bond ends on all other allies. Okay. So I don't like Divine Intervention, which, if you remember, is a monk divine favor skill that is 5 energy, quarter second cast time, 30-second recharge, enchantment spell, and for like 10 seconds or whatever, the next time target ally would take lethal damage or fatal damage, the damage is negated and the ally is healed for a big chunk of health. This isn't... Making it an elite and then affecting all allies is not a huge improvement to me. The fact that this is a 1-second activation time is a huge problem, because part of Divine Intervention is the fact that you can throw it on last minute. You can throw it on last minute, or last second, and know that you're going to be able to get your effect. And it does provide a nice buffer. Angelic Bond, on the other hand, is 1 second activation time makes it kind of clunky. The other thing is this takes up your elite slot, which is a huge downside. And I don't think it heals for as much as Divine Intervention does either, for what that's worth. I do think that this is a little bit better in that affecting all allies within earshot is... It makes this skill more usable in that you don't have to worry about targeting an ally to be able to apply it and all that sort of thing. But the fact that it ends after it triggers on one ally is a huge downside. I'd rather this be like a 10-15 energy skill and not have that end on all other allies' claws. At that point, it would be more reasonable to consider, but I still don't like skills like this. I don't like this effect very much. Because it is a bit more usable, I'm inclined to give it more like a 2, but it's very close. I'm debating between a 2 and a 1. Taking up your elite slot for an effect that I'm not a big fan of, and ending on all other allies, and having a 1 second activation time are all things that push it towards 1s. The fact that you don't have to worry about targeting a specific ally bumps it up a little bit in my estimation. I think I'm still going to give this guy a 1. I don't think I need... I think this would be a 2 if it didn't take my elite slot. But taking up my elite slot means that I don't want this skill, because this is not what I want to spend my elite slot on. That's kind of where things stand, I think. Okay, Angelic Protection. 5 energy, 30-second recharge, skill. For 10 seconds, anytime target other ally takes more than 130 damage per second, that ally is healed for any damage over that amount. Okay, let's be real. This is not a PvE skill. This is a PvP skill. The skill is for anti-spike. If somebody's getting spiked down, they're probably hitting that damage cap of 130 damage per second, and therefore will live. Of course, you can counteract this by staggering your spike a little bit, but that makes it easy to respawn, get heals in, get them healed up. So something like Word of Healing can heal somebody if it's taking, a couple of seconds to land a spike. Something like Angelic Protection can save somebody if they are being... Basically, you can't take more than 130 damage in any given second. This effect is not terribly useful in PvE. Not with a 10-second duration and a 30-second recharge anyway. It's the sort of effect that would be useful against some high damage enemies, like single hits. But if I'm being blunt, I prefer something like Spirit Bond, the monk enchantment, over this. Much shorter recharge, yes, costs more energy, but it will probably do more. You just don't get spiked out heavily in PvE very often. Enemies are just usually not that coordinated. If they are, it's very accidental. So this is totally a PvP skill, not a PvE skill. I'm still going to give it a 2 because it is a very strong counter to spikes, and I think it's worth reflecting that fact. The instant activation time is part of that, by the way. That's very important for this skill's functionality. But to me, this is a skill that would be nice to have a PvE version of that maybe had slightly tweaked stats to be more usable in PvE based on how PvE functions. I will add a caveat that I could see this maybe being a bit more useful in hard mode. I just don't play hard mode very often, so I don't know. But it's a good design for what it's supposed to do, because it does do that thing very well. It's just that's much more of a PvP concern. And hopefully I've made that point well enough, and I'm going to move on. Anthem of Flame. 5 energy, 1 second activation time, 10-second recharge, chant. For 10 seconds, the next attack skill used by each party member, it is an anthem after all, within earshot, because it's a chant, also causes burning for 3 seconds. So basically all of the party members' next attack skills inflict 3 seconds of burn when they land. This is fine. 3 seconds of burning is some nice additional damage. Obviously, Anthem's scale with number of people using attacks. I like this one okay. I'm going to give it a 3. It's fine. This is... To be fair, or to be clear, like this is a really nice, just sort of like standard Anthem effect. It's fine. It does the thing that I want. It adds damage to my party. It does so in a fine way. It can have some synergies with some of my other skills, such as Glowing Signet that we'll talk about later. They're on fire. Technically, it works with. But like, it's just kind of a fine skill. It's kind of a skill that I'm okay with bringing. To be clear, also, it kind of beats out some of the other like more narrow things, but it's not by any means like an exciting skill to me. Anthem of Fury. 5 energy, 1 second activation time, 10-second recharge, elite chant. For 10 seconds, all party members within earshot gain 3 strikes of adrenaline the next time they use an attack skill. Okay, the fact that this is energy is really important, theoretically, because it doesn't fuel itself, and you can use it at the start of battle to help kickstart the gain of adrenaline. But there's a problem with this skill. You have, like, in order to use this skill, or to make use of this skill, you have to have attackers that use adrenaline and have an energy skill to be able to trigger this at the start of battle. That's really when you want to use this. Now, it does help grease the wheels if you have adrenaline skills, because using an adrenaline skill, gaining 3 strikes of adrenaline will refill that skill quicker. It's okay in that regard. But it certainly, to me, seems like it would be at its best if it's being used at the start of battle and then leading with an energy-using skill to trigger this to gain adrenaline to fuel your adrenaline skills. That's not the tallest order. For example, it works well with some of the dervish attacks, energy attacks like Victorious Sweep. There's warrior options such as Counterattack or the mighty one. I forget the name of. Power Attack? It might be Power Attack. And there are certainly some options that you have in Paragon. And now I've listed all of the professions that use adrenaline. This one's kind of narrow. It requires building around specific ways. I don't think this one's a generally useful skill. It's certainly not a generally useful elite. So I'm going to give this guy a 2. I do think that there's some interesting build-around possibilities with it, but you are basically loading up on like Paragons, Dervishes, and Warriors, or professions using, more accurately, you're loading up on characters using spears, swords, hammers, axes, and scythes. You can do that. It can work well, but you're doing a specific thing. So just be aware of that. This is a build-around type skill. That brings us to Awe. 10 energy, 3/4 second activation time, 10-second recharge skill. If this skill hits a knocked down foe, or is used on a foe that is knocked down, would be a better way of phrasing that, I think. That foe becomes dazed for 13 seconds. It does have half the normal range, which is a little frustrating. I like that it works with shock, because shock and awe is a thing. It's a phrase, shock and awe. So you can shock somebody to knock them down. It's a touch range skill, so you're within that half range, and then you can awe them to daze them. This is, however, a very clunky dazed inflicting skill. We'll actually see down here, Spear Swipe is a version of inflicting daze that I prefer, but it is a pretty long daze for a non-elite skill. If you're, for some reason, running a Hammer Paragon, I have done that. This works really nicely as a way to inflict daze as well. You can smack somebody upside the head with some Hammer skill to knock them down, and then awe them. I'm going to call this one a 2. I feel that it is a bit of a build around me. You do have to be very intentional with using it, and it's a little bit awkward to use because of that half range. It feels like the sort of skill that almost needs to be in a primary attribute because it'd be too strong outside of one, but at the same time is a little bit clunky and weak because it's inside a primary attribute. So, I don't know. It doesn't have a really good home in either command or motivation thematically either. And I'm not quite sure. Like, Awe makes sense in leadership, but it sounds like the sort of skill that should do something based on your allies. Like, I could see Awe being a skill that's like for each ally around you or something like that, or something that affected all enemies as an alternative option of like kind of more of a whirlwind effect, or I don't know. But I mean, this is fine, I guess. I like the design restriction in that it gives you something interesting to think about how to build around, but it is very awkward to build around. And because there are other options for that, it kind of bumps it down a little bit. And I'm not quite sure why it's here. It feels... I don't know. Part of it is the name. The name feels very odd. I guess I don't need to scroll down just yet, do I? Blazing Finale. I did not pronounce that well, but whatever. It's 5 energy, 1 second activation time, 8 second recharge. It is an echo. For 30 seconds, whenever a chant or shout ends on target non-spirit ally, all foes adjacent to that ally are set on fire for 6 seconds. So this is a really powerful effect. That's a very long burn, and being able to repeatedly inflict burn like that is quite powerful. But it has a general echo finale problem of you're really encouraged to stack as much shouts and chants as you can, be able to trigger this as much as you can. AoE burning like this, like I said, is very strong, and the 6 second duration means that you don't maybe need quite as much. So maybe like a Go for the Eyes and a couple of other skills could be enough. Go for the Eyes, of course, being very useful for triggering these. This is I don't know. It's one of those things where it's a little bit difficult for me to evaluate. I think I'm going to give it a 3. The reason why I'm going to give it a 3 is because I think, given the fact that you are going to want to be using shouts and chants in Paragon, and the effect is quite strong, that I'm going to give it that sort of score. But you definitely need to be using shouts and chants to be able to make good use of this one, obviously, and it does encourage you to stack a bit more, but not quite as much as some of the other ones. So I think this is kind of as far as finale designs go, I think this is kind of a reasonable spot because of the fact that it inflicts a condition. The benefit that you get from it triggering, wow, I'm surprised somebody else is in the zone, has that inherent duration thing. Like, just reapplying burning it's not more useful, so you only really need to trigger this on any given character, every 6 seconds. So it reduces the benefit of spamming a bunch of shouts and chants. So I think this is kind of like the best possible finale design in that it's like, it's an effect that's useful, but doesn't dramatically increase in power the more shouts and chants you're using. So I just don't think there's very much space in that sort of way. So let's move on. Burning Refrain. So we're going to see more of this whole fire theme. 10 energy, 1 second activation time, 10 second recharge, echo. For 20 seconds, if target non-spirit ally hits a foe with more health than that ally has, which is a weird restriction, then that foe is set on fire for 3 seconds, and, excuse me, as a refrain, it is reapplied every time a shout or chant ends on that ally. This one's okay. I think I like Blazing Finale better. It inflicts longer burn, but also, and more importantly, it's a better condition. Usually you want to have more health than enemies, not less. So this one is kind of an interesting spot to play around in that it's like, thematically it's cool. It's like, oh man, they're stronger than me. I get to set them on fire when I hit them. Yeah, it's... Let's see. If target non-spirit ally hits a foe with more health... Yeah, so whenever you hit an ally with an attack that has more health than you, it sets them on fire. That, like, again, you typically don't want little health. So, I like the feel of the skill, but in practical terms, I think it is actually quite difficult to use well. And I think it would be hard to balance it in a different way that worked well as well. Because inflicting burning like that is quite strong, so they do need some sort of restriction. It's just a very awkward restriction, is all. I'm going to give this guy a 2. I feel like you can use it. I just feel like it's not very good, but it's not like trash tier. It's just not very good tier. Again, refrains, echoes, they're really, really, really hard to balance because they just last indefinitely. And just like having just perpetually, oh, I always inflict burning on enemies that have more health than me is really strong, so it's just hard to balance it well. It's just an unfortunate kind of way of things which designed. Burning Shield is 5 energy, 20 second recharge skill. For 8 seconds, while wielding a shield, Really important there. The next attack skill used against you is blocked, and if it was a melee attack, your attacker set on fire for 5 seconds. This is basically Shield Bash, Paragon version. Paragon version, instead of knocking down and disabling the skill, sets the attacker on fire. Note it works only on attack skills. That's fine because that's usually what you want to stop. 20-second recharge is a little bit long. 5 seconds of burning is really nice. That's going to be a pretty sizable amount of damage if it goes that full duration. This is one of those skills that I'm like, this is okay. Not exciting. It's not unexciting. It's okay. I'm going to give it like a 3 because of that. Yeah, I don't know. Again, I actually kind of like the fact that it only works against attack skills just because that means that you don't worry about it ending on incidental stuff, and so you're going to stop something that matters more than just incidental attacking. But does mean that you might need to use it a little bit carefully. But it is what it is. I kind of wish that this somehow... I kind of wish this was in Spear Mastery or something, so that way I could theoretically use it on non-Paragons. But both of these effects, Burning Shield and Shield Bash, are in primary attributes. I don't know what to make of that, but I think it's an interesting thing to consider. Let's move on. Defensive Anthem. This is 10 energy, 1 second activation time, 25 second recharge. Elite Chant. For 9 seconds, each party member within earshot has a 50% chance to block incoming attacks. This chant ends if that party member hits with an attack skill. Oh, hey, look, our attack skill trigger, because it's an anthem, not a trigger that I want to make use of. This is basically Aegis. Aegis is a monk enchantment. 10 energy, 2 second cast time, I think, 30 second recharge. That for like 9 seconds, each party member has a 50% chance to block attacks. That's full stop. I would generally prefer to chain Aegis than I would defensive anthems because of that ending clause. Although keep in mind, this can't be removed. This is one of those skills where it's really, really, really hard to balance it well because chants can't be removed. That's a very powerful line. The fact that this does not end on any attack is really important. This actually works better with a party of casters than it does with a party with a bunch of attackers, which also is contrary to most anthems. This is a very strong skill in the regard that is defensive, nice defensive support, and hard to remove. I don't think it's a good design idea because of that at the same time, but on the other hand, it gives more value to skills like Rigor Mortis, which perhaps the AI should be playing with a little bit more in general. So, I have mixed feelings about it from a design standpoint, but I think it's a solid skill. Like I said, I prefer chaining Aegis because it will work on my physical attackers that are using attack skills, whereas this doesn't work very well on them. But this goes up in areas with high enchantment removal, for example, against Margonites, because Margonites use Defile enchantment. Margonite necromancers do, which is obviously very powerful. And there's some areas that have like lots of Shatter enchantment, for example, where something like Defensive Anthem starts looking like a much more favorable option over Aegis just because it can't be removed. So stuff to keep in mind. I'm going to give this a 3. I don't use this very often. I prefer Aegis chaining, but I think there are situations where this is good, and I think this is generally a fine skill, so it's kind of where things sit. Unfortunate that you still need 3 copies to be able to maintain it indefinitely on your party. As an elite, I really kind of wish it had either a shorter recharge or a longer duration, so that way I could get it up to 100% uptime. But on the other hand, like at that point I'm bringing enough Paragons, and Paragons usually want attack skills that it kind of has some weird conflicts there. So it's got some interesting tensions built into it. Enduring Harmony. 5 energy, 1 second activation time, 10 second recharge, Echo. But notice it is neither a refrain nor a finale, but it is an echo. For 30 seconds, chants and shouts last 50% longer on target non-spirit ally. This is weird. So I like that it's an echo that's not playing into the very difficult to balance finale or refrain archetypes. This is a very 2. This is a 2. This is the sort of skill that you bring with you because you're trying to do some sort of funky build around, like you've picked some sort of chant or shout that you want to make last longer on you for some reason, and this is a way to do it. But this is not a skill that I would ordinarily bring because this effect is only useful if I'm bringing a shout or chant that I want to make last longer. I'm not quite sure off the top of my head what that skill is, although I believe that they exist. So yeah. I'm not quite sure where it is. I should point out, by the way, that Blazing Finale and Defensive Anthem and down here Signet of Return all have PvP versions, just because I was mentioning that with Command. But you can see far fewer skills. So yeah, this is a build around me. This is one of those Johnny Jenny type skills, Johnny Jenny magic archetypes. If you're curious about that, you can search about that. But this is a sort of skill for them. I think that there have been some builds that have been concocted that make use of this, but it's not a general purpose skill. I like that it exists, though. I like that these sorts of build arounds exist. I just wish Paragon had more skills overall. It suffers from the same problem Dervish does in that it was introduced very late into the full game's life cycle because it's a Nightfall, which means that it had fewer games to gain skills in compared to, for example, Warrior, the initial 6, or even Assassin and Ritualist. And that means that it has fewer skills to work with. So having build around me's does hurt a little bit more, but not... Having useful build around me's is more important than having... We'll talk about it when we get to Spears. We're going to talk a lot when we get to Spears. Okay. Moving right along, let's get on to Focused Anger. So Focused Anger is 10 energy, 60-second recharge elite skill. For 45 seconds, so not 100% uptime, you gain 120% more adrenaline. This is kind of like For Great Justice with, I think, better uptime and more effect. Actually, I might have For Great Justice. For Great Justice is one of those skills. Yeah, this is 20-second to 45-second recharge. You gain 100% more adrenaline. 120% is obviously stronger. And 45-second to 60 is better uptime. This is a little under 50%, and that one's 3/4, so 75%. For Great Justice does... You can make that one last 30 seconds with Enduring Harmony, so that's an option. That's an example of a time when you might want to do that. But Focused Anger, I believe, is part of the Imbagon build. I could be wrong. The effect is very strong. You are spending your elite on it, and you do need to have something you're wanting to do with adrenaline like that. To me, this feels more like a build around me. Because a lot of the time it's going to be elites. The Imbagon build, by the way, is one that kind of focuses on powering up some of the PvE only skills, particularly Save Yourselves, the Warrior one, that gives everyone 100, or all of your other party members 100 armor for a few seconds, but costs like 8 adrenaline. This allows you to be able to get it off far more often, and I think this probably stacks with For Great Justice. So they may be used together to like supercharge some of that. I feel that that's not something that, like, I don't perceive that this is a skill that I would generally use or want to use outside of very specific situations where I'm trying to make use of a lot of adrenaline. There's enough other skills and enough other elite effects that I'm generally going to want something elsewise. But I think that this is a reasonably powerful skill. This is one of those where it's like, it's mostly kind of a 2 build around me type of skill, but I think the inherent effect is strong enough that I'm going to go ahead and give it a 3. Just because having that much additional adrenaline gain is very strong. Little sad that I can't use this with Dragon Slash, but I could technically borrow it. No, I couldn't. I'd need to borrow it with a Mesmer skill, and that would mean that I couldn't be Paragon and Warrior, so yeah. Can't use this with Dragon Slash, but oh well. Definitely effect that gets me thinking. And like I said, generally useful. Although what you're spending your elite slot on can vary. So I will add that this skill only becomes useful with enough adrenaline skills, and without enough adrenaline skills, it is not any good. Glowing Signet. Glowing Signet is 1/4 second cast time, 20-second recharge. It is a Signet. If target foe is burning, you gain 13 energy. I mean, so this is... Design-wise, this is actually a fairly powerful effect because it doesn't cost any energy to use Glowing Signet. You gain all of that 13 energy. It's not being decreased by the amount required to use it. So this is okay energy management. It's just awkward in that it's in the energy management attribute. I understand why, because this would be a bit ridiculous to be able to give to anyone outside of this attribute, and also doesn't really belong in command or motivation. Leadership has a bunch of skills like that are like just random stuff that just don't belong outside of leader. That doesn't belong in Spear Mastery or Command or Motivation, so it's just kind of in Leadership. Glowing Signet, of course, plays into the whole burning theme that Paragon has. This is a 2 for me. It's very similar to the Soul Reaping skill, Signet of Lost Souls, that gains you energy and health if target foe has below 50% health, in that it's in the energy management attribute line. There are times where you want that, where you need more energy than that attribute line inherently gives you. And so there are times when I have made use of this skill, but they are kind of few and far between. Usually I'm going to want to bring more general purpose energy management a la, or along the lines of A space LA. Go for the eyes. So, it's a French phrase, right? Anyway. So, okay, skill. Moving on. Haste to Refrain. 5 energy, 1 second activation time, 10-second recharge echo. For 9 seconds, target ally moves 25% faster. This echo is reapplied every time a chant or shout ends on that ally. This one's a little bit tricky to use just because the duration is pretty low. So you do have to have shouts or chants ending pretty often on the ally to be able to keep this up. But even 9 seconds of them moving faster with occasionally extending the duration is pretty reasonable. This one's okay. It's basically lead the way, or this is kind of a good options for these. As far as refrains go, this one also is a little bit tamer in that, like, wall backing to keep it up doesn't do that much. Its energy cost is fairly low. I feel like this is one of those skills that I look at and I'm like, yeah, this is fine. This is like a 3. I'm going to give this a 3. I think it's fine. I don't tend to use it very often, but faster movement's always useful, and being able to do that to an ally in a way that can't be removed and that can extend its duration, it's fine. It's perfectly serviceable. This is probably one of the more balanced refrains, I think, but they're all still overall kind of difficult. It's just this sort of effect is less outright strong, but I think it's subtly strong, so I'm going to move on. Leader's Comfort. 5 energy, 2-second activation time, 8-second recharge. Skill. You gain 66 health. For each ally within earshot, which includes you, you also gain plus 18 health. It caps out at 140 health. I don't like self-heals that much. This one is especially bad, though. The time where self-heals are most useful is when you're by yourself. And the skill is bad when you're by yourself. If I have to run a Paragon by itself and I want healing, I'm going to want to go to another profession to get that healing. This is basically only really possibly useful in like T-Hark Orchard, where there's enough random NPC allies around that it can actually heal you. Otherwise, this is healing you for 66 plus 18. So let's see, that's 70, 84 health. That's just underwhelming. Leadership in general is bad by yourself, and Leader's Comfort is very much so that. Design-wise, I like this because it plays into the sort of being part of a team theme and being a leader and all that Paragon is part of. It's very Paragon self-heal, and unfortunately the situation in which I like self-heals is one where it's just especially atrocious. So, I'm inclined to give it a 2, just because I can see some situations where maybe you want to build where you do have self-heals going on to take some of the pressure off of actual healers. But I think I'm just going to be honest and say that this deserves a 1 because it's just not very useful a lot of the time. it doesn't heal enough in the situations in which I want to use self-heals. So I'm kind of feel forced to go to other professions, and that's kind of that. I'm lingering here for a moment because this is a sort of skill where I'm like, okay, how could this be changed in a way that I think would work better? Or I would like this better if it did something more with the allies. Like, if there's some additional benefits to this somehow, but I'm not quite sure what, and I'm not quite sure what would be appropriate or fair. So, I don't know. It's an awkward skill to try to even make good use of. Natural Temper. This is 3 adrenaline. It's a skill, just a skill. Interesting, no recharge, no activation time or anything. So it's used right away. It is for 9 seconds. You gain 33% more adrenaline while not under the effects of an enchantment. That's what it does. This skill sounds good. What it practically means is every 3 hits, you gain 4 strikes of adrenaline instead of 3. However, it does have a tax in that you have to, whenever you use it, it removes a strike of adrenaline from all of your other skills, right? So this one actually is not as impressive as it sounds just because of that sort of tax. It is definitely benefited by increased attack speed skills, and it does mean you have to limit some of the enchantments that you're using on your party if you're going to try to make good use of this as well. And for those reasons, I'm not a big fan of this. So I'm just trying to think, like, if you're attacking once every second, then this would gain you, like, what, 3 additional strikes of adrenaline, I guess? For 12 in 9 seconds instead of 9. It speeds you up a little bit, but also slows you down at the same time. And honestly, I just find the skill very underwhelming. I kind of get this space as trying to play around in, but this is the sort of skill that I'd rather be able to apply to an ally instead of having to use on myself. And it, honestly, I'm not sure how often you're actually getting that many hits in to get that amount. This probably gains you somewhere around 1 to basically around 2-ish on average strikes of adrenaline, is my guess, per time you have to reapply it, and then costs you 1 every time you reapply it. So its net is actually very low. So to me, I'm actually going to go ahead and give this guy... I'm going to give this guy a 1. But there is a slight caveat there. I think that this skill becomes more attractive in situations where you are using skills that gain you multiple strikes of adrenaline at once. So, in the instance where I'm running Dragon Slash and gaining, say, 6 strikes of adrenaline, this would pump that up to, or like probably 5. This would bump that up to more like 6 or 7 strikes of adrenaline. In those situations, this skill becomes a bit more attractive when I am gaining substantially more adrenaline. But those are such narrow circumstances that I'm not going to bump the score. For general use, I'm not using this. Enchantments are too useful, and this skill actually just costs so much adrenaline to keep up, because, again, using it removes a strike of adrenaline from all of your other skills, that I just do not feel that this contributes overall net enough adrenaline to be worth using, to be worth a skill slot. That's kind of my thoughts on it. It's a little bit more useful than the average one, but I'm not very impressed with it at all. Signet of Return. 5-second activation time, 5-second recharge. Signet. Resurrect target party member with 13% health and 3% energy for each party member within earshot. Includes you, obviously, so they're going to get at least that amount. This skill does not benefit much from attribute points, does it? If I take, like, almost all of my attributes out, 6% health and 1% energy, it does benefit some, but this is actually a skill that I tend to bring on secondary paragons a bit more often. This to me is an alternative to something like a Resurrection Signet. If you want a repeatable Resurrect, this is an option. I bring this some amount of the time in that capacity. I do prefer something like Resurrection Chant or We Shall Return, but in the instance where I do want to be secondary Paragon and energy is perhaps more restricted, say on a warrior, for example, I think Signet of Return is an acceptable option. Keep in mind, at 6% health, or like the 5 or 6% that it is at like 0 leadership, that still is per ally or per party member within earshot. So if you have 7 party members still alive, then that's still resurrecting with like 42% health. So this can actually be fairly strong and pretty reasonable, even without attribute point investment, which I actually kind of like that. So this is one of those skills. Like, I'm probably not just bringing this. I'm going to want to have some reason why I'm in Paragon already. But if I am in Paragon already, this is certainly an option, especially on something like a warrior that cannot, literally at base energy levels, cannot afford We Shall Return. So I'm going to give this guy a 4. It is a 4 with sort of the asterisk next to it of like, yeah, I bring Resurrection Chant and We Shall Return more often than this, but I think this is a totally reasonable choice, and I think this is a fine Resurrection skill choice. So it's maybe a high 4, or high for it to be a 4, or like 4 is a little bit high for it. Maybe 3 is a little bit more appropriate, but I'm going to stick with it there. Because I will use this on secondary Paragons even with no investment in leadership, and I think that's a sign that the skill's kind of strong enough. And I think that this is a really good way, actually, I should add, of applying the counting party members, counting allies type mechanic that Paragon has, because that makes the skill a fine way to resurrect an ally if it's just one dead ally, but it's not going to allow you to come back from being down to just yourself if there's enemies around, because resurrecting somebody with 6% health or even 13% health is just not enough for them to have any sort of durability. But when there are enough party members, like, I like the way that basically this is not a way to recover from a wipe in the middle of battle, but it is a way to get somebody up in the middle of battle, if that makes sense. And I find that to be a really interesting little place for it to be. Design-wise, We Shall Return is, with good command investments, a much better way to turn and wipe around, obviously. But anyway, that's some thoughts on this skill. Soldier's Fury. 5 energy, 1 second activation time, 5 second recharge, Elite Echo. For 30 seconds, if you are under the effects of a chant or shout, you attack 33% faster and gain 33% more adrenaline, but you have minus 20 armor. So this is a variant on Aggressive Refrain. So if you remember, Aggressive Refrain was an echo that made you attack faster, but you had less armor, 20 less armor, but it's reapplied every time a chant or shout on you ends. That's not the case with Soldier's Fury. Soldier's Fury actually fits into the mold of a soldier skill, of which we actually see a bunch in tactics. So just as a refresher, Soldier's skills and tactics, Soldier's defense, Soldier's speed, Soldier's stance, and Soldier's strike all do a thing and then do more thing if you are under the effects of a chant or shout. So for example, Soldier's defense is a block, and is a block that only works while you're under the effects of a shout or a chant. Soldier's speed is a run speed buff that is more effective while you're under the effects of a shout or chant. Soldier's stance gives you increased attack speed while under the effects of a shout or chant, and Soldier's strike becomes unblockable if you're under the effects of a chant or shout. So that's the soldier theme, and it's being maintained here in Soldier's Fury. Soldier's Fury is an echo that is not in the refrain or finale mold, which I find interesting. Just like Enduring Harmony, I don't know if there's any others of those. I guess we'll find out, but there are 2 of them, and I think that's a better space to kind of try to do echoes, honestly. But the big issue with this one is it is very clunky to make good use of. You do have to be under the effects of a chant or shout in order to get this, and I don't know if you've been noticing, but a lot of those kind of ends pretty early. Like they have specific end clauses. So here's the thing. Paragon, randomly enough, is actually really bad at having shouts or chants that it maintains on itself. Something like They're on Fire is an example of one that does. Lead the Way you could technically use on yourself to keep it up. Something like a Godspeed or Incoming, Help Me are different ways that you can. But for the most part, I guess something like Stand Your Ground, it works well with. So there are some options, but excuse me. As a point of matter of fact or whatever, I feel like Warrior is a bit better at having those. To the Limits being a really good example of that. To the Limit is a really good soldier enabler, but at that point, I don't know why I'd be using Soldier's Fury necessarily over Soldier's Stance, although you could, because the increased adrenaline gain and 100% uptime is certainly a benefit. This is one of those skills that I feel is as a 2 for me, because I do have to specifically build around making sure I'm bringing shouts that I can maintain. Without that, this skill is not doing anything. And if I'm being perfectly blunt here, Aggressive Refrain is generally, I think, a bit better than Soldier's Fury. Because of the fact that it reapplies itself and always works, I think that's better. But this is a reasonably strong skill if you are able to have a shout, most likely, that you're keeping up with it. It can be fairly powerful in terms of, like, the effect is good. It's just getting that effect to work is really awkward. And that's the big issue here. I don't necessarily want to spend my lead on this, and it's very much so you have to be building around it to make it function. It's the sort of skill, though, that's hard to balance well because it's an echo. You can't remove it, so what are you going to do? And that's part of the problem. Making these things balance is hard. That brings us finally to Spear Swipe. Spear Swipe is 10 energy, 20-second recharge, spear attack. If this attack hits, you deal plus 17 damage, and your target is dazed for 9 seconds, but it has melee range. This means you have to run up to the enemy. That said, this is a non-elite way of inflicting a relatively long-lasting dazed, so I think the skill is actually pretty strong. If I do want to be specifically doing daze, I'm probably going to do some slightly different things, but this is actually a very, very viable skill, and I've been kind of impressed with it. So, a bit clunky to use, but the daze lasts long enough that it's actually pretty good. So, I understand why it's in Leadership and not Spear Mastery, because I think it would be too strong in Spear Mastery for anyone to be able to use it. I'm going to give this guy a 3. The one thing that's a little bit funny about this skill is you could use this with, like, almost no investment in Spear Mastery and still get a really good effect off of this in terms of the daze duration. If I am specifically trying to daze with the Paragon, though, I do tend to prefer the Elite. And if I'm looking to be inflicting daze, I often prefer something like Broadhead Arrow. That tends to be my go-to way of inflicting dazed. Stuff to keep in mind. But I do think that this is a reasonably powerful skill. And it's playing in an interesting spot of the idea being you're whacking somebody with a spear instead of throwing it at them, and therefore requiring melee range and all that. So anyway, that's going to go ahead and wrap stuff up for Leadership. It's got a lot of fine stuff in it, but for the most part, nothing terribly exciting. So next time we'll be talking about motivation. And until then, everyone, take care. Goodbye.